Well, good morning. Just out of curiosity, are all of y'all from the area? Are you new to the area? I always need to know where to start. Okay. We got native charlatans, or everybody else is new? Okay. So few of us.
Yeah.
People don't believe me when I tell them I grew up in a small town, Charlotte. But in the early 60s, it was a completely different place.
Yeah.
All right, well, welcome. We will we'll be running through this a little fast. Normally, we incorporate a stroll through the graveyard and a trip down to the spring in this. It rained all night. The grass may be a little wet. The slopes may be a little slippery, so I leave it up to you whether you want to do that today, or I'll give you the verbal version of it, and then you can, at some better time, walk through. And
We could ask people to wear walking shoes.
yes. Okay. Well, good. We'll give it a shot. Where to start? The people that settled this area in the 1750s. This was the back country. We tend to think of the frontier as something that moved east to west, and generally speaking, it did. But in this part of the country, the frontier moved from north to south, beginning around 1700 and accelerating into a flood. Ulster Scots, these were lowland Scots who 100 years previously had been resettled in Northern Ireland to placate and pacify rebellious Irish Catholics. They had flourished there. I've always thought of it as pioneer boot camp. These people moved into an area where they were not particularly welcome initially, and they had to kind of hack their farms and their subsistence out of the land, and they became very successful at it. In fact, by 1700, they were a serious source of competition to English wool and linen industry, and they had commercial contacts, particularly through the ports of Philadelphia. The last Stuart queen, Queen Anne, began trying to impose the established Anglican hierarchy in Northern Ireland. And we kind of lose track of what an established church means. The Church of England was the established church of England and all of her possessions. Nothing was official unless it happened in the Anglican Church. You could not be baptized. It was illegal for any other than an Anglican priest to perform a baptism. It was illegal for any other than an Anglican priest to perform a wedding. So you had technically, particularly in Northern Ireland and other places, a large percentage of a population that was not officially married and whose children were not officially baptized. They were more concerned with the baptism of their children than their legal marital status, and that even in the colonies, Presbyterian ministers, for example, were barred from performing marriages or baptisms. For that, you had to go to an Anglican church. But beginning about 1700, the imposition of the Anglican hierarchy in Northern Ireland, these people just decided, we're going to leave. There's a better land. There's a promised land yet across the water. And they moved and left in droves. It's thought that a large percentage, maybe as much as a third of the Protestant population of Ireland came here before 1775. And they settled in all parts of the colonies, but primarily they came in through the port of Philadelphia. They moved into western Pennsylvania, and then they moved down the Great Wagon Road, which comes through western Virginia into North Carolina, and eventually South Carolina. Eventually, it's theoretically ends in Augusta, Georgia. As you look at the dates of establishment of Presbyterian churches, you see they get progressively older as you go north up the Wagon Road, up through the Shenandoah Valley and in Maryland. One of our pastor emeritus, Roy Coker, pastored churches in western Virginia, and he, I think the first church he pastored was established in 1740. As you come down the road, you see progressively newer churches. They were hastened in their trip south by the French and Indian War. There was a lot of fighting in Western Virginia, a lot of Indian deprivation in Western Virginia. And those that had settled there picked up and moved again and began moving south. Among them, Alexander Craighead, who was a kind of a firebrand. He had been invited to leave Pennsylvania by the presbytery there because he delivered a couple of sermons in which he assured his parishioners or his congregation that the only king they owed allegiance to was King Jesus. So you can imagine the discomfort that put the presbytery in. So they suggested that he move along, which he did. He moved into Western Virginia and then further south. By the early 1750s, he was here. He established himself at the the Sugar Creek Church up on the north side of town. And he rode a wide circuit preaching to various congregations in the area. And this was one of them. And the place that he preached was the rock that is across the road over here, what we call the preaching rock. It is the spot that along the road, which was a kind of a secondary path. We're not sure if it's an Indian trading path or a very early colonial path, but it was a track, a path, not really worthy of the name road. The rock there was kind of a landmark because it marked the spot of a spring on the backside of the hill down there. And that spring served as the source of water for people and animals for all of the church's early history. When I arrived here in 1994, I think we were just getting connected to the municipal water system. They were working right on the spring at that point, but this area has become urban relatively quickly. The demographics of the area have changed dramatically in the last 25 or 30 years. But as they filtered into this area, these Ulster Scots, they became to be called Scots-Irish in this country, or sometimes just Irish. They filled in the area. The reason they came here, the draw here was safety. In 20th century strategic parlance, they moved under the defensive umbrella of the Catawba Indians. The Catawba were a fairly fierce and aggressive tribe. They were one of the few that were allied with the British during the French and Indian War. So this was a place of refuge. Nobody liked to mess with the Catawba. The Cherokee had invited the Seneca down from the Ohio Valley about 100 years earlier to settle in the foothills as a buffer between them and the Catawba. And that ignited a 100-year-long war between the Catawba and the Seneca that resulted in the Seneca eventually being driven back into Ohio. They were run completely out of Ohio. The Catawba were ultimately defeated by disease. There were two great smallpox waves of epidemic between about 1750 and about 1770, which almost entirely wiped out the Catawba. Certainly broke their military power. Just as an aside, the Catawba were received the only colonial reservation. They petitioned the government of South Carolina for land set aside for them, and that's the Catawba reservation is just across the line. And it was a square, but it was on the diagonal, and that's why the North Carolina border at that point makes that funny jag. That's the north edge of the Catawba reservation. So they were here, and everything was on that side of the road. The first minister was Craighead's son-in-law, William Richardson. Richardson was an interesting fellow, too. He was English-born, but he had some Scottish relatives, and he attended the University of Glasgow in Scotland, where he fell in among Presbyterians and had a life-changing experience. and came to the colonies. He was not ordained until he arrived in Virginia. He was not ordained in Scotland. He was ordained here. And had a great penchant, great drive, zeal for missionary work. His first target were the Cherokee. So he came through here, stayed a while with Craighead, went on to try to evangelize and convert the Cherokee. Got no takers. Remember the Cherokee were allied with the Catholic French, and so they weren't really interested in what an English missionary might have to say. So he came back. Craighead, you remember Craighead had a daughter, so he came back and married Peggy Craighead, and established himself at what we now call the Old Waxhaw Church, just across the line. It's officially got a Lancaster mailing address, but really not in town. And he also covered a wide area on horseback, preaching and shepherding various congregations. This was the most northern one, and Craighead asked him to serve this church. So he was our first minister in 1767, and that's generally the date that we associate with the establishment or the organization of Providence Church. Though there's argument that the church may have been actually organized a year or so prior to that. But regardless, by 1767, we finally had a minister, which were in short supply. The Presbyterian Church insisted on college-educated, seminary-trained ministers, and this is in the 18th century, so you can imagine how rare these people were, and getting them into this part of the country was even more difficult. But it also explains, it goes to the heart of classic Presbyterianism and their obsession with education. Almost immediately after establishing the church, the congregation built schools. The Presbyterian doctrine required almost that at the minimum, the head of the household should be literate and be able to read and interpret the Bible so that he could teach his family, so that he could shepherd his family. And in fact, travelers through Scotland in the late 1600s remarked that this small, poor, backwater country had the highest literacy rate in Europe. And people were surprised to find that their blacksmith was able to debate theological points with them. Very interesting. Providence was no different. They established schools and really were fully responsible for all education in the community until the 1920s. There were at least 2 schoolhouses. There was Providence Academy, which was established. We know it was established by the 1740s. We know it was in operation by the 1740s. And included a female academy, which was one of the few in this part of the world at that time. Music was taught. They had instruments. People were taught music, but not in a sense way. Not music was not really part of worship in classical Presbyterian form. Just a quick aside, through at least the early part of the 19th century, the only instrument that was used was a tuning fork for singing. There were no instruments inside the church. There was no Easter celebrations. In Presbyterian theology, every day is Easter. Why pick out one day? We celebrate the Lord's resurrection every single Sunday. We're not going to pick out one as being more special than the other. No Christmas. Christmas was a co-option of a Roman pagan celebration, the Feast of the Saturnalia, which included a lot of carousing and carrying on, and we're not going to have any dealings with that either. This church, though it was built, the sanctuary, though it was built 100 years after the first arrival of people here, still reflects that theology. It was very plain, as you see. None of this would have been anathema to them. They would have pitched that right out the door. A cross and candles, and that was exactly the kind of thing that was part and parcel with the Protestant Reformation. It's just this smack of Catholicism and idolatry. We're not going to have that. itself, very plain, very straightforward. Everybody, through their reading and understanding of the Bible, was to find their salvation in direct commune with God. There were no intervening priests. There was no intervening liturgy. People were they took the priesthood of believers very seriously. Just to walk through our building process a little bit. I know this is disjointed. The first church was probably a log structure on the other side of the road. We're not really sure where it was. The second structure was built in 1804. It was a wood frame building, a two-story building, also on that side of the road. We think we might know where that is, based on grave dates. If you look at the cemetery plat, I'm not sure where, but somebody could probably point out where they think it might have been. That building served until 1858. The interesting thing about that building is that by that point, many of the members had slaves, and many of their slaves were church members, were communing church members. But they were relegated to a loft in that building that was accessible only by a ladder on the outside of the building. And the loft was too low for a grown man to stand in, so it was very cramped. So part of church lore, and there's no reason to dispute this, is that by the late 1850s, several things were coming together, but one of them was the enslaved members of the congregation went to the session, or sent a representative to the session, and asked for some better accommodation than what they currently had. The result was this building, which was built over the winter of 1858-59. It was built primarily by the congregation themselves, with the help of their slaves, and relatively little cash money was spent on it. They spent $2,500. Now, that's the equivalent of about $60,000 today, but that's still not a lot of money. The timber was cut locally. Carpentry was done by local people. The building was actually much bigger than what was required at the time, based on the size of the membership. So they didn't even, typical Scottish frugality, they did not even put all the pews in. They didn't fill up the place with furniture until they needed it. So it wasn't full of pews. There was no carpet on the floor. There was none of this. This upper area is the slave gallery. In the 1970s, it was renovated, much to its hurt, in my view. You see, I don't know if you've been up there yet, but it's flat. Kind of, the way the floor goes is kind of funny. You've got the pews in this chevron style, which are terrible from the line of sight. You can't see anything except for the head in front of you. But originally, the floor was slanted. You see underneath here, that's the floor. And there were long benches, what we might call bleachers, that ran the length, which did provide good line of sight. Everybody could see the pastor. The building was probably very comfortable in the summertime. You've got these 8 triple hung windows that open top and bottom to let in any passing breeze. Very high ceiling. So that and the woods were close at hand as well. So that it's my guess that even in the summertime, except the most sultry Sundays, this would have been a not unpleasant place to sit. One of the older members of the congregation who passed away in the last couple of years told me that when she was a child, before the building was air conditioned, they still opened the windows. She said when a wasp would come, everybody would kind of lose interest in the preacher and kind of follow the wasp around until it lit or went out the other window. And I imagine it's sort of like watching people watch a tennis match, just watching back and forth. There was no carpet. The carpet was not installed until about the turn of the 20th century. As comfortable as it might have been in the summer, this would have been a miserable place in the winter. It was not heated except by a wood stove which sat in the back somewhere in a sandbox. The stovepipe went up came forward and went out through the ceiling where you see what's left of the exit of the stovepipe. It would have been drafty. I imagine that the premium seats in those days were nearest the wood stove in the wintertime. There is no subfloor. You can see the flooring out in the narthex area there. When you slither up underneath the building, and I don't recommend it, we have thoroughbred spiders breeding under there. You can see daylight through the cracks of the floor. So you can imagine the draft, the cold air coming up through the floor. Never underestimate the power of chilly women. It was the women of the church who paid for the first oil furnace, and then, or paid for the first coal furnace, and then in the 1920s had a bake sale or several bake sales over time to pay for its conversion to oil. Furnaces go in basements. This building has no basement. It's built on a fieldstone rubble foundation. It's actually, there's an outcropping of bedrock that it sits on this side, and then there's fieldstone rubble that's sitting on this side, which is why it wants to sink in that direction. We've had to have the thing cabled together to keep it from racking. The building certainly outlived its design life. But in order to accommodate the furnace, they had to hand dig a basement, and that's what the little shed building there right outside the window is. That's covered the stairway that was hand dug to get down into, to dig a hole underneath here to put the furnace in. It was present. I think the HVAC system we have now dates from that 1970s renovation. So the carpet also seems to help the draft as well. To go back to the narrative, the church grew at a good pace initially, and then by the 1850s began shrinking. Membership began shrinking. A couple of things were happening in Mecklenburg County at that time. One, in fact, all over North Carolina, there was a lot of out-migration. People were leaving this area to go south and west as new land, new cotton land opened in Mississippi and Arkansas and East Texas. So that a lot of people were kind of picking up and moving to better lands there. And the people that were moving in were not Presbyterian. I mentioned the Presbyterian insistence on a very well educated pastorate. Other denominations, primarily Baptist and Methodist, were not so concerned about that. And they were able to fill what otherwise would have been a void in church establishment. So you had this huge growth of other denominations in the area. And that's why today you see large numbers of Methodist and Baptist churches, particularly in the South, that far outstripped the Presbyterian Church's ability to provide trained ministers to serve congregations. By the you want to try and run it down there? All right.
We haven't done that in a while.
All right.